The golden sun dips low over the Iraqi desert, dragging long, distorted shadows across the crumbling mud brick remains of Ur. This is the cradle of civilization, the silent land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, the wind whistles through empty chambers, carrying the grit of centuries. It is a place where time seems to have stopped, yet the earth beneath these ruins remembers a different reality. Long before the stone stood silent, this landscape was a vast, marshy wilderness, untamed and unpredictable. The horizon stretched flat, broken only by the reeds and the unpredictable flooding of the riverbanks. It was a world waiting for a hand to shape it. The air was thick with the scent of damp silt and the promise of change. As the last light of the sun fades into a deep, bruised purple, the silence of the desert deepens. It is in this stillness that the first settlers arrive. They do not come with fanfare, but with the intent to claim the parched earth. They stand at the edge of the marshes, looking out over the expanse, ready to carve a future out of the mud and the water. The era of the wanderer is ending. They set to work with wooden tools, biting into the sun-baked crust of the earth. The ground was stubborn, cracked by months of heat and devoid of life. They dug deep, rhythmic trenches, carving lines into the landscape to intercept the river flow. The first attempt failed. The water surged too fast, breaching the banks, and flooding the worksite with thick, suffocating mud. They did not retreat. They widened the channels, reinforced the embankments with packed silt, and waited for the river to yield. Slowly, the water began to move where they directed it. It seeped into the parched soil, turning the dust into dark, fertile clay. Within weeks, the transformation took hold. Tiny, vibrant green shoots of barley pushed through the damp silt, a sharp contrast to the surrounding wasteland. It was the first harvest of a new age. The settlers stopped moving. They abandoned the temporary shelters of the nomadic life and began to lay foundations. They mixed mud with straw, pressed it into molds, and left the bricks to harden in the relentless sun. The wanderers had become builders. The marshy wilderness was now a grid of life, and for the first time in human history, the people had a place they could call home. The village of Uruk swelled, its boundaries pushing outward as the population grew with the harvest. Small houses of sun-dried brick multiplied, forming dense clusters of activity. But the people wanted more than shelter. They sought a monument to their permanence. At the city center, the ground was cleared for a massive foundation. Laborers arrived in lines, hauling heavy, rectangular clay bricks. The work was relentless. Men and women moved in a synchronized rhythm, passing materials up wooden scaffolding. Each brick was a commitment to the earth, laid with mortar that bound the structure into a singular, immovable mass. The ziggurat began to take shape, a mountain-like temple rising from the flat horizon. Its steep, stepped stairs climbed toward the clouds. The structure demanded everything: resources, time, and absolute coordination. The ziggurat stood as a testament to what could be achieved. The marketplace hummed with the friction of exchange. Merchants stood amidst mounds of grain, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus of negotiation. But memory was a fragile ledger. A dispute erupted when a shipment of barley arrived short of the agreed count, and with no proof of the original deal, the trade collapsed into shouting. The solution emerged from the very mud that built the city. A merchant picked up a handful of damp clay, flattening it into a palm-sized tablet. He took a reed, its end cut into a sharp, triangular wedge, and pressed it into the soft surface. The reed left a clean, distinct mark. He pressed again, creating a sequence of symbols that represented the quantity of grain. As the clay dried in the sun, the marks hardened into permanent records. This was no longer just a transaction. It was a binding contract. The wedge-shaped impressions, known as cuneiform, spread rapidly through the city. Priests used it to track temple offerings, while administrators used it to manage the growing wealth of the state. What began as a simple method to settle a dispute transformed into the world's first script. It was a silent, unyielding tool of power. Information could now travel across distances and survive the passage of time, granting those who held the stylus control. The era of the independent city-state reached its violent conclusion in 2334 BC. Sargon of Akkad did not merely seek tribute, he sought total unification. He organized his infantry into a disciplined, bronze-clad force that moved with a singular purpose. They marched out of Akkad, their footsteps heavy and rhythmic, shaking the dust from the plains. The independent kings, accustomed to local skirmishes, were unprepared for the scale of this advance. Sargon's soldiers did not break formation. They advanced like a wall of metal and resolve. When they reached the gates of a rival city, the defenders watched from the ramparts as the bronze shields locked together, creating an impenetrable front. The clash was swift. Sargon's infantry breached the walls, forcing the local rulers to bow or face the total erasure of their sovereignty. He swept across the landscape, moving from the Persian Gulf to the shores of the Mediterranean. Every city that resisted was absorbed into the growing network of his command. He replaced local autonomy with a centralized authority, binding the disparate regions into the world's first true empire. The empire was massive and inherently fragile. The dust of Akkad had barely settled when the empire fractured. Without a central hand, the region dissolved into chaos. Power became a whim. A strong man took what he wanted. A weak man lost everything. Justice was whatever the local ruler declared before breakfast, and forgotten by sunset. Then Babylon rose from the silence. King Hammurabi stood before a towering block of black basalt, its surface rough and unyielding. He did not raise a sword to enforce his will. He raised a chisel. The metal bit into the stone, sending shards flying with every strike. He ordered his scribes to carve the rules of society directly into the rock. No more verbal decrees that vanished with the wind. No more judgments shifted by mood or bribe. The chisel moved rhythmically, etching wedge after wedge. A merchant accused of theft stepped forward, trembling, expecting his hands to be cut off on the king's impulse. Instead, Hammurabi pointed to the fresh cuts in the stone. The punishment would fit the crime, not the temper of the judge. The era of arbitrary rule ended. The age of written justice had begun. Centuries later, the nature of conflict shifted. The Assyrians abandoned bronze for the unforgiving bite of iron. They forged weapons that shattered older blades and engineered massive siege towers that groaned as they rolled toward enemy gates. These wooden behemoths, reinforced with metal, slammed into city walls until the mud brick defenses crumbled into dust. The sound of their advance was a rhythmic, terrifying thud that signaled the end for any who resisted. Yet, this was not a culture of pure destruction. While their armies razed the plains, their scholars were busy in the capital, Nineveh. They treated the collection of knowledge with the same obsession they applied to their conquests. Scribes worked in the shadow of the palace, carefully cataloging thousands of clay tablets. They gathered the wisdom of the past, from ancient myths to mathematical proofs, storing them within the walls of the library of Ashurbanipal. It was a storehouse of human thought, protected by the same iron-fisted military that terrorized the region. The iron sword cleared the path, and the clay tablet preserved the legacy. Nineveh stood as the undisputed master, a monument to the belief that power was only as strong as the history it could control. Nebuchadnezzar II looked upon his work and saw a wonder. He had raised the Ishtar Gate, its blue-glazed bricks, shimmering under the relentless desert sun, like a mirage made solid. Beyond it, the hanging gardens climbed toward the sky, a lush, artificial mountain of greenery, defying the parched earth. It was the pinnacle of Babylonian ambition, a city that believed itself eternal, but the rivers that fed its life were fickle, and the tides of power were turning. In 539 BC, the horizon darkened with a new force. Cyrus the Great stood before the gates of Babylon, his army a silent, waiting shadow against the walls. The city that had defied empires for generations did not break with a siege engine or a rain of arrows. It simply reached its limit. The gates swung open, not to the sound of crashing timber, but to the weight of an inevitable conclusion. The era of the independent Mesopotamian kings ended in that quiet surrender. The golden age of the city-state dissolved as the new conquerors marched through the blue archways. There was no final battle, only the fading echo of a civilization. Today, the wind is the only inhabitant of these crumbling foundations. It whistles through the gaps in the mud brick, carrying the fine, abrasive dust of a history that once commanded the world. The ziggurats have weathered into shapeless mounds, and the canals that once turned the desert green are choked with silt and salt. The kings, the priests, and the merchants are long gone, their names etched into tablets that now rest in quiet, climate-controlled rooms far from the heat of the Euphrates. But the disappearance of the city is not the end of the story. We are not as far from these ruins as the centuries suggest. Every time you pick up a pen to sign a contract, you are using a system of accountability born in the shadow of a basalt stele. When you glance at a clock to calculate the minutes of an hour, you are following the sexagesimal math of the Sumerians. When a judge stands in a courtroom to uphold a written law, they are echoing the standard of justice first carved into stone in Babylon. We walk in the footsteps of those who first dared to impose order upon the chaos of the wilderness. They built a world from nothing but clay and water, and in doing so, they provided the blueprint for everything that followed. The empires fell, the walls turned to sand, and the rivers shifted their course, but the architecture of human civilization remains. The legacy of the first city is written into the very fabric of how we live today.